Here we are, we're at the end of your first term, and you're nearing the moment when you'll get the first round of some formal feedback accompanied by some marks on some of your work. And let's be quite clear from the outset, marks and feedback are not the same thing. Anyway, the question on the table this week is what you're going to do with that feedback, how you'll get the most out of it. I wonder, will you skip straight to the mark and not really read any of the comments? Perhaps you'll read some of the comments but not all of them, maybe the general gist of the summary but nothing on the essay script. Maybe you'll read it all, but you'll decide that you disagree with half of it and leave the rest. And I would hazard a guess that you probably won't read it a second time. You'll have got your mark, and that will probably feel like the main thing. So before we go much further, I want to ask you perhaps the most important question of all. Why are you here? So spend a couple of minutes really pondering that question. Why did you apply to university at all? And why to a music course of all things? Now you'll have your own unique backstory to how you ended up here, but the underlying motivations are mostly pretty common, and one or another of the following are probably in there somewhere. Well, because you just do a degree, don't you, and music was my best subject at school. To play more, to meet new people to play with, and to improve my instrumental skills. I want to perform, but I know that I need a backup in case it doesn't work out. Or I want to teach, whether that's schools or instrumental teaching. I don't really know, and maybe even just for the sheer fun of learning. But let's think about the question in a much more general way. What's the basic purpose of you doing a music degree? Is it to learn stuff? Is it to learn how to do something? Is it to learn how to think? Is it to encounter new ideas just for their own sake? Perhaps it's to avoid having to get a job, or maybe to get a degree to improve job prospects. I ask you all of this because it does underpin the very question of what it is that you want from feedback. What you're aiming for determines in no small part how you treat the feedback you receive. If you just want a degree because of some abstract principle about graduate employment prospects, then the finer details of feedback may not seem important. But if you're at all interested in improving your skills, or your understanding, or your knowledge base, then you want to know a bit more about how to improve. It seems fairly obvious, but I do think it passes a lot of people by in the way that they treat their feedback. So before we move on, let's establish a working definition of feedback. What I quite obviously don't mean is the kind of feedback that comes squealing out of an amplifier in some basement bar on an open mic night. But in fact, that pretty much is the same as what we're talking about here. Some sound comes out of the amplifier and enters the same microphone or pickup that the amplifier is plugged into, which makes the sound louder, and so the loop continues. If we replace the characters involved, it makes sense. Some piece of work comes out of a student and gets picked up by some other person, perhaps a lecturer, who sends the piece of work back to the student in a modified form with their comments and thoughts, and the student then produces work that is informed by those comments. So, it's question time again. What do you get feedback on, where do you get it from, and what form do you get it in? Well, let's just have a quick look at what the university's Code of Practice says that feedback must do. It says that feedback must lead students to revisit the activity that led to the feedback in the first place. It goes on to say that feedback provides information targeted to the individual's recent responses and prior knowledge, and then that it guides the student to refine his or her understanding through continued practice. But this doesn't say anything about the timing of feedback, or the mode of feedback, or the source of feedback. Now, a good deal of your feedback will come on Turnitin after you've submitted a piece of written work through Vital, but if you start looking actively for feedback, then it's in a lot of other places as well. And one of the big factors here is about the timing of feedback in relation to your work. What you get after submitting a piece of work for assessment is called summative feedback, and this is feedback on work that sums up that you have achieved the learning outcomes of the module. Most of the time you'll get this a little while after the submission. The department's commitment, and the university's, is to a 3-week turnaround, and that might be slightly longer if there's a Christmas or Easter holiday involved. What you get along the way is called formative feedback, and this is feedback that helps form your ideas, your thinking, or your skills. That might be instant, like advice on better instrumental technique, or it might be time-delayed, like if you sent an essay plan to a tutor for comment. And sometimes these two things might be the same thing. In fact, you could say that most of the time summative feedback should also be formative. You might have one assignment which is quite directly related to the next one, but you also generally want to find in your summative feedback some kind of advice that's not only related to what you did right or wrong on that piece of work, but also how to improve in any other piece of work. So there's a logical implication here that not all feedback is written feedback. Sure, you might actually get some verbal summative feedback, although that's not common. But what I mean is that you will quite often get formative feedback in verbal form, in a tutorial about an essay plan, for instance, or in an instrumental lesson. But also, any time you express a thought and someone else comments on it, agreeing, disagreeing, debating with you as to whether you understand a concept, that's its own kind of feedback. So feedback happens all the time in conversations, in lectures or seminars, and that means that the source of your feedback isn't always your lecturer or a teaching assistant who might mark your work, but sometimes it's your peers as well. So that means that all of the following count in some way as feedback. The general comments summarising your performance in an assignment, any annotations and comments on your script, some general comments on how the entire class performed in a certain assignment, and you should normally be able to find these on Vital after all of the feedback has been returned. Rubrics in Turnitin, which would give you general advice on particular areas which are common to most essays, like argumentation, engagement with literature, and so on. A comment in class from a tutor after you've answered a question, or a comment in class from a peer when you've made a comment. A one-to-one tutorial on an essay plan before you write it up, or a tutorial to clarify written feedback after you've had that back. And then there's much more besides. But to be fair, perhaps the most focused feedback that you'll ever get is that written, summative feedback after you've submitted a piece of work. So the big question now is, what do you do with that feedback when you get it? Now, the first thing to say is that receiving feedback is way harder than giving it. As the recipient of feedback, you might have to read between the lines a bit and take criticism that might not make you feel that good. But being able to receive and use feedback well is without a doubt the key to unlocking your absolute maximum potential. Without it, you're just accidentally achieving, not making the most of your ability. Let's go back for a moment to the principle that I emphasised at the opening of this video, that feedback and marks are not the same thing. You might well skim the feedback when you read your mark, but don't mistake that for really processing and using the feedback that you've been given. And because of the emotions that are often associated with both marks and feedback, the best thing to do is almost certainly to go back after the initial tension of getting the mark and spend some more deliberately reflective time with the feedback itself. So the first thing to do is to carve out some time and some space to review the feedback in detail, and make sure that you're in the right frame of mind to do it. You have to be able to be very objective about your work in order to judge the fairness and the helpfulness of the comments. Make sure that you've got your work and the feedback to hand, and make sure that you've got all of the comments, those on the script, the summary paragraph, and any rubric that might have been used. You can review the elements of feedback in any order that you like, but I'd recommend having some kind of logic to it. You might try reading the rubric for a general overview, rereading your essay all the way through, and stopping at the annotations on it as they come up, and then reading the summary paragraph afterwards. You'll probably then have to tie all of those elements together and see how they interrelate. You might even have to review the assignment brief in order to view the work from your assessor's point of view. And it'll take you a while, probably longer than the 30 minutes or so that it took to write the feedback in the first place, but it will give you a good, objective overview of the strengths of your work and the areas in need of development. Once you've done that, rather than just making a mental note of the whole thing and hoping that you do better next time, write up a development and action plan, and I do mean write it up. Identify up to 3 areas that you need to work on developing for future assignments, and write a list of those things that you think you need to do in order to develop those areas. So you might want to work on the structure of your essay, and that would mean looking up some relevant resources and taking an essay plan to your tutor before you write it up next time. And then keep to one side, but do write them up as well, any minor action points that are easy to fix for the next assignment. Checking the details of your referencing format or running a spell check, these are the kinds of things that you might have there, anything that's really easy to fix. So I've made a PDF of a development and action plan that you can find on Vital, and you can fill that out for each assignment that you get feedback on. You'll find that under Skills Video Materials. I've also made a PDF for doing what's called a SNOB analysis, which you might find helpful to do before you write up your development and action plan. And for this, you're completing 4 boxes. The first is strengths, things that you did well and that you can continue to do in future assignments. The second is opportunities, places that you went wrong or you missed something that could have helped you gain more marks. N stands for needs. These are things that you think you need to do before the next assignment to give you the best chances of improving your marks. And B stands for barriers, things that might get in the way of you doing those extra things. Obviously, you should then try and figure out how, if at all possible, you can remove those barriers in order to be able to achieve those needs. And if you do the SNOB analysis first, then you'll be in a really good place to summarise things for your development and action plan. So this week you'll have a one-to-one meeting with your academic advisor to review your first term, and you should do whatever reflection you can on your progress so far. Obviously you haven't had any summative feedback yet, but you can give some careful thought to any informal or formative feedback that you've had. So before you meet with your advisor this week, write up a development and action plan based on your reflection. And as soon as you've got any summative feedback, then write up a SNOB analysis and update your development and action plan. You'll meet with your advisor again at various points next term and throughout the next few years, so you can bring this kind of reflection to them any time that you meet to discuss your progress. Well, that's it from me. I would say that I'll see you next time, but that really is it. Have a good Christmas break, and I'll see you all kicking about next term.